What are Donald Trump's real motives in Venezuela? Is his action actually legal in any way? And what does this mean for the rest of the world? These are the questions we're going to attempt to answer in this video, so like, share and subscribe. Now, we know that the whole world watched with mouth gaping open and in complete shock as the US conducted airstrikes over Venezuela and actually took Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, and his wife into custody / kidnapped, depending on which side of the legal argument you are on, and flew them back to the US to face charges on drug trafficking charges in a US court in something called Operation Resolve, conducted by the US Forces and Intelligence. Now, Maduro, according to Reuters, is being held in New York and is due in court anytime now. Second question, is this legal in any way? The answer is no, a resounding no across all fronts. Donald Trump did not seek sanctions from his own government, from the Congress, the US Congress. There are rules in the US that require a president, even if he is doing a completely sort of covert, quiet operation, to consult with at least 8 members of Congress, 8 important members of Congress, which he did not do apparently. He has not sought that sanction and he has not received it. Also, in the UN Charter, because obviously flying into another country and taking their head of state into custody is a violation of the sovereignty of that country. Article 2.4 prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, according to the UN Charter. And legal experts who have looked at all of this and the analysis that has come out has said, based on the scale, the target, the location, the context, this looks like use of force that does not fit the bill. So basically, United Nations members are not allowed to violate airspace, water or land of any other country unless you're doing it in self-defense or you're doing it with the permission or the consent of the lawful government. So the lawful government has asked you for help in some way. So either self-defense, consent of the lawful government, or the UN Security Council authorization. These are the only 3 routes to justify the actions, but neither of these 3 routes apply in this case. So under Article 2.4, this is completely illegal and it's prohibited because it doesn't fulfill those requirements. The UN reaction reported in the media also looks at this as a dangerous precedent, which it is, and I'll come back to that, urges restraint and respect for international law. Has the US done something like this before? Yes, it has. Regime change is what they call it in the US, and they do it all the time. Remember Afghanistan, which it claimed self-defense though in after 9/11, and it accused the Taliban of sheltering Al-Qaeda and sheltering terrorists. And in response to 9/11, they walked into Afghanistan. Iraq in 2003 is a much closer sort of example. They said weapons of mass destruction under Saddam Hussein, and a regime change there was framed as global security. Syria in 2014, it was a counter-ISIS operation, and it was framed as protection of civilians against the use of chemical weapons, which Assad was allegedly using against his own people. So every case begins with a security narrative and later expands to regime control and longer-term involvement. So let's actually compare Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria with what has happened in Venezuela from an American point of view. In Afghanistan, the UN had actually recognized the right to self-defense. In Iraq, there was no UN mandate, and it was widely viewed as illegal. In Syria, there was a mixed legality because there was a large anti-ISIS sentiment across the world. But the interesting thing to look at is what happened after the regime change. In Afghanistan, it was followed by a 20-year war, and now the Taliban has taken over. In Iraq, the state collapsed. There has been violence. There's been the rise of ISIS. Complete chaos in Iraq. In Syria, prolonged civil war, a proxy battleground, again, complete chaos. Another similarity. In Afghanistan, it was like minimal strategic resources, but in Iraq, major oil reserves, although it was later said by America that it was not about the oil. In Syria, oil and strategic geography. And over a period of time, we've seen in all of these three places, thousands of people being displaced. In Iraq, millions of deaths over time. And in Syria, one of the worst refugee crises in history. So the things that are similar here is America using various reasons to justify a regime change to involve itself in the management of the natural resources of that area, but leading to chaos. So America does not have a great track record as to what happens after the regime change. They normally leave these places in complete chaos. Now, what are the global consequences of what has happened in Venezuela? It weakens the UN Charter because, one of the most arguably powerful country in the world has thumbed its nose at the United Nations saying, you know what, we don't really care what your charter says, we're going to do what we want. And sort of Trump's route to all of his action has always been, okay, so you disagree with me and you call it illegal, what are you going to do about it? The truth is nobody can do anything because the US is the most powerful military in the world. And he's also shown and displayed through his entire tariff battle in the first half of his term, that people want to do business with America. So it's unlikely that any other country will bring any sort of sanctions against America for this. And so nobody's going to do anything about it. So quasi the UN Charter doesn't really matter. It sets a precedent for arresting leaders of other countries. And then it sort of leaves a loose description or a loose definition of what that arrest would mean. So tomorrow, a country, let's assume China, can decide that, oh, Taiwan is illegal and doing wrong things for XYZ reasons. Let's just fly in and arrest their leader and take over the country. Now, who decides what is a bad leader and a good leader? Who decides which citizen needs to be rescued from which leader? And on what basis, right? So what it does is basically lead to a weakening of the global structure as we currently know it. The question that I do want to look at is, why is America doing it? Is it oil? Is that the strategic price? Let's take a look at how much oil Venezuela actually has. It has, and I'm quoting, the largest proven oil reserve in the world. Venezuela has more oil than any other country in the world, 303 billion barrels. That's 17% of the global total, surpassing even Saudi Arabia. Now, what has happened despite having all of this oil, that country is so badly managed, with bad corruption, under a bad regime, under a dictator, which Maduro is, in fact, and it's been confirmed by global viewers that he's been a bad and a harmful dictator for his people because the economy is in shambles, there are human rights violations, and he has repeatedly overturned elections to keep himself in power. And because of that, they have not fully been able to produce the kind of oil that they could with the right type of organization. Now, it's important to remember that most of the oil in Venezuela is extra heavy crude, and it's technically more difficult and more expensive to produce, to drill and to produce, and it is a highly valuable infrastructure to rebuild over there. Under sanctions, China has become the largest buyer of Venezuelan crude. About 80% of the exports have been going to China as of 2025. So these are all reasons why Trump finds this very interesting. Production at one point peaked to 3.5 million barrels per day, but it has since fallen to 1 million barrels per day because of mismanagement and a collapsing of their infrastructure. And analysts believe with the right investment, it can go back up to at least 2.5 million barrels. So effectively, it's all about the oil to begin with, but it's also about power. Trump's move is also being seen as a bid to bring Venezuela's oil and its power back to the Western commercial orbit, primarily US refineries and allies, and out of the orbit of competitors. So it basically wants to stop this oil from going to China and wants to keep it in the Western Hemisphere. US refiners are optimized for heavy crude, and so they can handle it well. And this will meaningfully shift global patterns back into the Western Hemisphere. The other big thing is obviously US versus China. China has invested heavily in Venezuelan energy sector over the last decade. They've actually been taking oil in return for loan repayments. So they hand out massive loans to Venezuela via its corrupt government. And instead of taking the loan back, it's been taking oil back. That's how Beijing has become the 80%, controlling 80% of that business. The Beijing itself has condemned the US operation and warned the US of that it should not be controlling Venezuelan oil, and called it a unilateral overreach. But again, Trump is going to turn around and say, what are you going to do about it? Trump's intervention may be intended to disrupt China's foothold in Latin America. Remember, China has been working a lot in Africa and Latin America to take control of a large-scale infrastructure and resources, mining, oil, things like that. Russia has also supported Maduro politically and economically, including in the oil trade. Russian officials have condemned US action as illegal and destabilizing. Now, effectively, I want to take a slight step aside to explain something called the Monroe Doctrine to you. This was in 1823. US President James Monroe effectively wrote out a US policy. This was 200 years ago, that said that the Western Hemisphere, so North and South America, is America's sphere of influence, and outside powers should be kept out or should stay out. This was a policy, this was a foreign policy idea that the US had. Now, effectively, what is being seen here is that Trump is exercising that idea and saying, you know what, South America, I am the big daddy of South America, and I will manage the problems of South America. So a more compliant Venezuelan government in Caracas will allow the US to assert influence in the entire hemisphere. So also Cuba, which has a large presence in the Maduro government, comes under this influence. So it will be able to control security frameworks, economics, and politics in the area. Some analysts are also suggesting that Trump's broader aim is an America First doctrine to re-establish the US dominance in this region. So remember, it's about the oil and it's about the power in the region. So let's come back to what's happening right now. Who's in charge in Venezuela? Well, there is a vice president, a woman called Delcy Rodriguez, who will serve, we understand, as acting president. And so there is a continuity. Even as Maduro is in US custody, their government continues. Although in an interview that Trump gave last night, what was last night for us in India, he warned Rodriguez that she could face consequences that are even harsher than Maduro, if she fails to do what the US wants. Essentially an ultimatum that she must align to US expectations. So what Trump is doing is allowing her continuity in the government, but saying, hey, unless you do what I ask you to do, we will replace you as well. So we'll have to actually see how this plays out in Venezuela to see what Trump decides to do next. So the US is presenting multiple motives, is presenting narcotics accusations and a broader claim of security and regional stability. But Reuters is reporting subsequent coverage also shows that it's openly about oil, it's about control, it's about investment, and it's about reopening Venezuela's oil sector to US influence. Now, here's the question that we have to ask. What does this mean for the rest of the world? For those of us way on the other side of the globe, for India, for China, for Russia, what does this mean? Now, for China, let's take for example, this is not legal sanction. It doesn't change international law, but it does create a precedent of a collective condemnation. So basically, China could now turn around and say, hey, here is Taiwan, which we have been interested in for a very long period of time. If we frame it as internal security, anti-terrorism, law enforcement, we're not invading, we're enforcing order, just like the US did. So if tomorrow China decides to march into Taiwan, what argument will the US technically have to stop them? That's one thing. Russia has done this with Crimea, it's done this with Ukraine. This will actually give Russia the fillip it needs to walk into other parts of Europe if it wants to. Who's going to stop Russia? As we've seen, all of the West has not been particularly successful in actually stopping Russia, because Moscow could say, hey, the US captured another country's president and flew him out. We've entered Ukraine to remove what we see as a dangerous regime. Now, who's going to argue with us? So all of these things could actually, like I say, they deeply weaken the UN Charter, change the way global politics actually works, where now it's not a question of let's peacefully find a way out of this together, but it's more a question of who is strongest and who can get away with whatever they want to do. Because remember, we talked about America first, right? What this is also deeply protectionist, where each country will say, hey, this is what is good for me. I'm going to take what is good for me. Is Greenland next? Because there are resources there that America is interested in, and they want to be able to keep Greenland away from Russia. So is Greenland next? Are there other parts of the world that America is interested in that they're going to walk into? This is a very dangerous shift in global politics. And if this gets normalized, then what it does is that it basically says the most powerful forces in the world do not need permission. They can do whatever they want. The rules will only be broken by the strongest, and the rules then no longer protect the weaker countries. This is the biggest perhaps change we have seen in global order since the Second World War. There are questions about, is this going to be another Iraq? Is it going to be a third world war? Is it going to divide the world into different blocks? We don't really know. We're going to have to play it out to see. We'll have to watch and see what happens. But effectively, what is very, very clear is that the rules as we knew them up till now no longer apply. Things have changed starting today. And it does seem, whether we like it or not, that Donald Trump is in charge. Leave me a comment in the comment section on what you think is actually playing out and how this is going to affect the world as we know it.